the limitations inherent in the attribution of civil rights to black people. As much as I might be critical of universalizing the civil rights paradigm and making it stand in for every form of freedom, I don't want to underestimate the importance of the struggle for civil rights. Now, if we look at the history of slavery reveals that African-descended slaves were legally treated as property. In the eyes of the law, black people were chattel and thus could not be recognized as having any legal personality. This is why slaves could not testify in court and basically had no standing within the law. However, there was one exception to this denial of legal personhood, and that was when a slave committed a crime. Now, property can't commit crimes. Property has no agency. So in order to hold black people, slaves, accountable for crimes putatively committed, it was necessary to make an exception. An exception had to be granted in order to hold slaves accountable before the law. And so it happened. This is very interesting. Saidiya Hartman actually writes about this process quite compellingly in her first book, Scenes of Subjection. Black people acquired legal personality, and this is the first step towards acquisition of civil rights, right? They acquired legal personality through their culpability, through their legal culpability. This negative aspect of civil rights, the granting of due process in order to find the subject guilty, right? The very fact that the subject is granted due process to civil death, which is the state of the prisoner. And so, I would argue there is a civil rights struggle to be conducted on behalf of those who are behind bars, who have been disenfranchised, who lose the right to vote, and who are otherwise denied civil rights. I don't think we should forget that George W. Bush, remember him? I don't think we should forget that he would not have been elected, or rather, as I was saying yesterday evening, he was not really elected. Anyway, he was selected, right, by the Supreme Court. But he would not have reached that point if former prisoners, so we're not even talking about people who are in prison, we're talking about people who move out of the prison into the so-called free world, bearing the traces of that civil death, if they had not been disenfranchised. If a fraction of the disenfranchised black population of former felons had been able to vote in Florida alone, in one state alone, Bush would have been out of the picture. And so we think about what a changed world we might inhabit right now. You know, had those former prisoners not been denied their civil rights. So that is one of the important struggles, civil rights struggles underway. But I think, I would say that the most important civil rights struggle at the beginning of the 21st century is the campaign to defend the rights of immigrants. The attack on immigrant rights is largely focused on Mexicans and Central Americans. But undocumented immigrants are identified as the national enemy. And while the face of the undocumented immigrant is the Mexican or Central American, the Islamophobia, which has become such a poisonous force over the last period, makes the ideological assumption that people who practice Islam, or who look like they might want to practice Islam, are foreigners and potential terrorists, right? And as I was pointing out yesterday, I live in California, Northern California, in the capital of California, Sacramento. Not very long ago, perhaps 2 weeks ago, 2 elderly Sikh men were shot down as they were taking their evening walk by someone who identified them because of their turbans as Muslims. So this is one example of how urgent it is to create a civil rights movement designed to protect the rights of immigrants, both undocumented immigrants, people who are perceived as being immigrants, even though they may have been in the country for generations, which is the case with Sikh people in California. Now, I was talking about Mexicans and Central Americans, and perhaps you're familiar with the wall that is being constructed along the U.S.-Mexican border, a wall that reminds us of the wall on the West Bank. And just as the wall in the West Bank represents the Israeli policy of apartheid against the Palestinian people, the wall along the U.S.-Mexican border represents the U.S. policy of scapegoating Mexicans and Central Americans, who are, as a matter of fact, a major source of agricultural labor. The agribusiness in California and Arizona and other places could not exist without the labor of immigrants from Mexico and Central America. And they're also an important part of the community that contributes to the tax base of many cities. There's this assumption that undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes. Well, they may not pay income taxes, and they probably don't make enough money to pay income taxes anyway, but they pay taxes everywhere whenever they purchase anything. So what do civil rights for undocumented immigrants entail? First of all, the right to education, the right to health care, the right to use services that have been created for women who find themselves the subjects of violence. And as it stands, immigrants do not have the right to health care, the right to education, the right to unemployment insurance, the right to be free from racial harassment. And I should say that there was one piece of legislation that Barack Obama did support, not as powerfully as he might have, but it was called the DREAM Act. And this legislation was designed to allow young people who were already in college or university, who were undocumented, to allow them to take advantage of paths to citizenship. And so in the context of this campaign to support the DREAM Act, many people